Many sports cars and race cars throughout history have set out to prove the old saying that less is more and bigger isn't always better. This is not one of those cars. A few days ago, I was perusing my copy of Lawrence Pomeroy's classic book on early race cars, and I was sad to see that despite being one of the craziest and most advanced performance cars of these early years, the Fiat S.76 is never mentioned. And that's primarily because the Beast of Turin, as it's known, despite racing currently, specifically at Goodwood, well, it was never used as a Grand Prix race car. And it doesn't help that after World War II, when Pomeroy was writing this amazing book, the car was somewhat looked down on, a sort of joke really, and it was not really understood. But with all the information we have today, I think it's fair to say that this might be the single most insane vehicle ever made. One of the more overlooked but perhaps most interesting periods in automotive history is that time from before the First World War, and specifically after 1905. In the UK, it was called the Edwardian period. Across the world, from the US to Italy, brilliant minds were working tirelessly to figure out how to make cars faster both in a straight line, but also around a track. With their engines securely nailed to sturdy wood frames, the world watched these special one-off factory cars power past 100 miles per hour at places like Brooklands. Now, top speed really was the name of the game at this time for those manufacturers wishing to sell sports cars. Breaking land speed records was important for branding and overall sales, and it was also just a lot of fun. Our understanding of aerodynamics at this time weren't what they are today, so really at this time the path to getting more speed was to just make more power, and the key at this point to making more power was, well, bigger. In 1909, this ideology came to a head when the German company Benz and C and the great Carl Benz made this, the Blitzen Benz, a one-off or few-off land speed vehicle featuring a 21.5 liter inline-4, making some 200 horsepower and holding the land speed record at Brooklands for averaging 126 miles per hour for 1 kilometer. This was an interesting time for those European manufacturers who were interested in racing, because at this point there was just one Grand Prix race and it was held in France, and since the French manufacturers hadn't won the race in 1908 like they had in the previous years, they just stopped holding the race altogether. Mercedes was just too fast for them, and this left a sort of hole for those manufacturers wishing to really push the limits in terms of performance, and this is really what brought about this obsession in Europe with land speed records. Over in Italy, some of the higher-ups at Fiat felt that they could do better than the Blitzen Benz, so they set out making one of the single most insane cars ever, the S.76. Now at this time, Fiat was making incredibly advanced race cars. Their S.74 Grand Prix car was a 16-valve overhead cam straight 4 of about 14 liters in capacity. For this new car, they basically kept that formula but just upped the cc's. Making more power at this time wasn't really about more revs, it was simply about displacement. More cc's, and man, the S.76 had them in droves. This inline 4 was 28.4 liters. These individual pistons are significantly larger than paint cans, if that puts things into perspective. It produced a whopping 300 horsepower and an estimated 2,000 foot-pounds of torque, all at about 1,000 RPM, which meant that in 1910, you were only allowed to drive it if you had a nice, big, thick mustache. If you didn't, there would be no way that you could handle all that power, and I'm not kidding, you guys will see why in a moment. Now, I said that understanding of aerodynamics wasn't what it is today. Still, when you compare this car to other land speed record and race cars, you can see just how ahead of the game Fiat was. As a whole, this car was really just as much an experiment in weight savings and streamlining as it was in horsepower. Still, the car really is the engine, much in the same way that the Honda CBX also is the engine. This is the largest engine to ever be put in a car. It weighed about 3,700 pounds, that is the whole car, and the engine was most of that. It's not like it had complicated electronics weighing it down or front brakes for that matter. A simple but incredibly long ladder frame held the hulking engine, and it was connected to a solid axle suspended by leaf springs in the front and also in the rear. Though the car was designed as a whole to be able to handle itself, there's no getting around the fact that cars really weren't made at this time for this kind of power and torque and speed. You have to have a real sack to actually be willing to push these land speed record cars to their limit. And once the car was complete, Fiat struggled to find somebody who could actually tap into this car's full potential. Remember what I said about mustaches? Well, one of the first testers was a fella by the name of Felice Nazzaro, and he would be heavily involved in the car going forward. He was an Italian race car driver from Turin, Italy, which is Fiat's home. And he was one of the first people to test the car. And though his mustache may have had a nice form to it, it just wasn't quite thick enough. One ride in the S.76 and he gave up on the test, never to return to the car again. Their test drive was described as a vortex of sound, and it was at this point that the car's infamous nickname was born. Felice dubbed the automobile the Beast of Turin, which is probably the coolest name ever given to a car. It would haunt his nightmares forever. Fiat then built another S.76, and that car was sold to a Russian prince named Boris Sokhanov. And Sokhanov hired another Italian race car driver named Pietro Bourdino, a nice-looking chap and an accomplished racer, but at this time racing wasn't really about hitting crazy top speeds in the straights like it is today. Most race cars were maybe producing 70 horsepower at this time. And it also wasn't that long before this that people had been known to die of heart attacks when they experienced newer levels of top speeds. And most important of all, Pietro had no mustache. Well, at points he had no mustache. You have to be committed to the mustache life to be able to handle this, so his chances of being able to really push this car were low. His first top speed attempts at Brooklands ended short of 100 miles per hour. He'd had enough of this death trap, and in all honesty, Brooklands just wasn't made for this car. It was quite rough at this point. There are actually reports that Bourdino had the thing going 120 miles per hour on regular roads, which was only a few miles per hour shy of the land speed record, and he was out doing it on public roads. His co-pilot couldn't get him to slow down, and apparently the exhaust would singe people's hair as they drove through towns. On the sands of Saltburn, the Beast would beat the flying mile record that had been held at Brooklands of 119 miles per hour, but the flying kilometer was 126, and this car didn't hit 126. Now, it's worth noting that many of the cars that were flying past 100 miles per hour at Brooklands were struggling on the sands of Saltburn to hit any more than 80 miles per hour. So, it's hard to say, but it seemed as though this car had easily the potential to power past that record. But officially, at this point, the S.76 didn't hold the land speed record. Now, over in Russia with the other S.76, the prince set out to find a man ballsy enough to push the Beast to its limit and take the land speed record, and it turns out he needed to look beyond Italy and beyond Europe to the great US of A, and this Babe Ruth looking dude, Arthur Duray. Now that's a mustache. And it's under his direction that the car would power past 132 miles per hour in Belgium. Because of various technicalities and rather silly circumstances, and actually a stubborn train driver, it wasn't awarded originally, but later on he would prove the car's capability, and there are reports that it was even powering past 140 miles per hour. Now, after all of this, it all became kind of muddied, and the two S.76s that did exist just kind of disappeared from history, and it wasn't really known where they were or what happened to them. We do know that they were used for racing and that different engines were put in them, and there's this one comic about it, but other than that, it was kind of lost to history. Much of what we officially know about this car today, though, is thanks to the research and work of a British man named Duncan Pittaway. Even still today, if you read online articles, you'll find people saying things about the car, things like, it was powered by an airplane engine, which is what people thought for decades, but it's not accurate. Now, I highly recommend this talk where Duncan goes through the entire history of the car and his own personal story with it. Duncan set out to find the car, and he began collecting what parts he could find, and soon he had everything from the original car except for the engine, and he eventually found the engine from the other S.76, and he was able to piece them together. At this time, Fiat was famously taking their race cars apart at the end of each season so that they could hide their developments from the other manufacturers so that they couldn't steal their technology, and that's exactly what happened with the second car. So after 3 years of constantly buggering people in Italy and building rapport with the individuals involved and the people who had stuff from this car, he was able to get the engine and pair it to the other car's chassis and running gear. He ended up making his own gearbox, and he took the seized engine took it all apart, rebuilt it. Here's him actually showing some of the parts from the original engine, which is pretty crazy. After years and years of relentless work and loads of money, and most importantly, a sort of manic approach to perfecting everything, the car was completely restored and done, and they fired it up for the first time in 100 years. Now you'd think looking at Duncan, a Brit with no mustache, you'd wonder how this guy could ever drive the Beast of Turin. But despite admitting his innate fear of the car, which I think you kind of have to have, he does indeed drive it today. And at one point, it was driven, not trailered, but driven 150 miles to Goodwood, just out on regular roads, once again singeing pedestrians' hair. Like all great car stories, it's often the people behind the car that makes the story great. A car like this could very easily just be sitting in a museum with a plaque next to it, detailing its incredible story and its performance capabilities, but it's nothing compared to actually seeing the thing driven, even on a regular road, but also on a racetrack. It's just incredible what Duncan has done for the world in showing off this priceless, rare beast of a car from 100 years ago. In my opinion, we need more people like him, and we need more collectors like him in the car world. People who are less interested in their collection and just hoarding what they have, and who actually want to get out and experience these amazing machines. It makes you wonder how many other incredible automobiles have been lost to time or simply aren't used at all as they were intended, just sitting in a museum or a collection. The sad thing is, despite the fact that these old machines are really quite simple and pretty robust, people are all too often afraid to actually use them. But I think investing your money and time, as Duncan did, in not having so many cars, but in actually taking the cars that you do buy and really going all the way with them so that they can run and drive, I think that's much more interesting and fun than just collecting more and more rare cars to just sit somewhere. In all honesty, I actually struggle at this point to really enjoy car museums whenever I go to them, because for me, a car sitting behind a rope so nobody can go near it, it just feels wrong. It's just not what cars were ever for. Sure, they are rare, sure they're pieces of art, and many of them are priceless, but see, the kind of art that cars are meant to be is art in motion, you know? Seeing the Beast of Turin sitting still would be pretty cool, you know, its sheer size, its presence, but man, seeing it fired up and even more speeding down the highway effortlessly, it's just wonderful. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this video and this story. I've linked a bunch of videos on the car if you guys want to see it driven and also raced. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed it. We'll see you in the next one. Drive safe.